Often the gospel reading has multiple possibilities for us to consider. Today is no exception. We have the Greeks who come seeking Jesus, significant because they are foreigners who are asking to be received by the Jewish miracle worker and teacher. There's the communication style of Philip. Then Jesus' profound and very serious statement about his time. I want to focus on the next piece of this passage. There aren't very many times in the Bible when we actually get to read a direct quote of God. These words should sound familiar to us. We've seen very similar phrases in the other Gospels. Jesus prays that his actions will glorify God's name, and God responds. In this context, even though the words are, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again, it sounds very much like the declarations at the baptism and transfiguration of Jesus. This is my Son, the beloved. In him I am well pleased. Even though God uses a personal pronoun to describe what is happening, it is clear that the glorifying comes through Jesus, not independently of him. In other words, God is saying, you've done me proud, and you will continue to make me proud in the ways you serve and honor me. Pretty amazing stuff to hear. It must have given Jesus a huge boost of confidence and some deep, deep comfort. But this wasn't just for Jesus' benefit. God wanted the people around Jesus to get this message too. Otherwise, there was no need to speak out loud. Notice, even though everybody heard God's voice, many did not recognize it as a voice, let alone as the voice of God. They thought it was thunder. Those who realized it was a voice thought it was an angel speaking to Jesus. They didn't realize that they had the very unique privilege of eavesdropping on a conversation between Jesus and God. As I read and reread this passage, I keep thinking about how odd that sounds, that the voice of God booms down from heaven and the people don't really hear it. Then I realize that isn't surprising at all. How often do we not hear, not recognize God speaking to us? In fact, that's one of the prime motivating factors behind the God is Still Speaking campaign of the United Church of Christ. We have become so accustomed to not hearing God's voice that we often fail to recognize it, even when God speaks very clearly to us. You've heard me say several times that it took me 15 years to finally listen to my call to seminary, and that even then I didn't realize that it was a call to ordained ministry when I first began that seminary journey. The message I had been getting was very clear: go to seminary. Over and over inside my head. I just didn't recognize it, that the source of that message was God. It took a lot of outside help for me to finally accept that what I had been trying to ignore was a true call. Honestly, that wasn't the only time I didn't recognize the voice of God speaking to me. It took several invitations, nudges, and a small dose of guilt for me to hear a call to become a Sunday school teacher and get active in the Christian education programs of my church. But when I finally let myself tentatively listen to that still small voice, I found myself excited by the most rewarding volunteer work I have ever done. There is nothing quite like discovering faith with a bunch of kids and learning together about God. Back to our scripture. When God spoke, some people didn't hear words. They heard thunder. How is it that God could speak out loud and they didn't hear a voice? How did they mistake words for thunder? It's pretty easy. We hear, see, even taste and smell what we expect to experience. They didn't expect to hear a voice from heaven. So when God spoke, They didn't even think they were hearing an angel, like some of the people in the crowd. They heard noise, static, a distraction, but nothing meaningful. Others heard the voice, but couldn't properly identify it, like answering a phone without looking at the caller ID and then trying to guess who it is that's calling. They weren't in the habit of listening for God to speak, so they didn't have a frame of reference to be able to identify God's voice. We probably all have stories of times when we are certain that God communicated directly with us. A friend who commuted from Jackson to Detroit for several years told me of times on her drive that she'd suddenly have a strong sense that she needed to slow down. Moments later, another vehicle would lose control or a driver would make a terrible mistake that had she not listened to that voice in her head, she would have been involved in a horrendous accident. She attributed that voice, that sense, to God. Sometimes we get a feeling that a loved one is in need of our attention, so we call or revisit. Sometimes it's a 3 a.m. wake-up call that it's time for prayer. I thought this was God's special way of getting my attention, but I've discovered that lots of people find themselves suddenly awake at 3 o'clock with a prayer burden for themselves or for other people. In fact, if my patients tell me that they've been waking up every day at 3 and they don't know why, I've begun asking them if there's something or somebody that they need to be praying about. So far, all of the people that I have asked have looked very surprised at my question, but have said, yeah, there is. There are lots of stories from 9/11 of people who escaped that tragedy because of little things, little voices distracting them from their normal routine, making them just a bit off schedule, so they didn't catch their flight or so they didn't get to the office on time that day. One man spoke of stopping for donuts for his coworkers, something that he had never done before, but an idea he couldn't shake on his way to work that morning. I heard stories of several people who were scheduled to be on one of the planes who had a sense that they needed to change planes, a sense so strong that they actually listened to it, and in listening, their lives were saved. It's not always a voice in our heads, though. There was the story of the man who had gotten new shoes that had been so comfortable the day before in the store, and when he first put them on that morning, but as he walked to his office, his heel began to hurt. So he stopped off at a drugstore to buy a pack of Band-Aids, and that saved his life. Another person had gone to bed feeling fine, but woke up with a sore throat that was so bad that she called in sick when she had never, ever missed work in her entire life. Scriptures tell us other stories of God speaking. Little boy Simeon was at the temple, training under Eli to become a priest. He helped the older man get settled into bed, then went to his own bed, but was disturbed when he heard someone call his name. So, being the obedient child that he was, he got up and went to Eli, who said it wasn't him, go back to bed. The same thing happened again. This time, Eli told Simeon to speak back if he heard his name being called. Sure enough, Simeon had no more than gotten settled into his bed when he heard someone call his name. This time he said, "Here I am, Lord." "Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night." It's an important story, but not just because Simeon received his call to be a prophetic voice to Eli and the people of Israel. It is also important because it shows us that we must consider the possibility in order to be able to know that God is speaking to us. Without Eli's help, Simeon may never have figured out that God was trying to talk to him. Ironically, the message God gave Simeon was for Eli. Apparently, Eli wasn't such a great listener all the time either, and God needed to use a child to get through to him.